I am thinking of the moment when Goethe penned the words annoying gadfly. I am thinking of the pleasure he experienced, and I imagine him suddenly coming to a realization. In his whole life, he had never acted as he wished to act. He considered himself the administrator of his immortality, and that responsibility tied him down and turned him stiff and prim. He was afraid of all eccentricity, even though it also strongly attracted him, and when he committed some eccentricity, he subsequently tried to trim it down so as to keep it within the bounds of that sunny equanimity which he sometimes identified with beauty. The words annoying gadfly did not fit into his work, nor into his life, nor into his immortality. Those words were pure freedom. They could only have been written by someone who already found himself in the third stage of life, when a person ceases to minister to his immortality and no longer considers it a serious matter. Not everyone reaches this furthest limit, but whoever does reach it knows that there and only there can true freedom be found. These thoughts passed through Goethe's mind, but he forgot them at once, for he was old and weary and his memory was bad. Let us recall she first came to him in the guise of a child 25 years earlier in March 1832. When she heard that Goethe was seriously ill, she sent her own child to him at once, her 18-year-old son Sigmund. On his mother's instructions, the shy boy stayed in Weimar 6 days with no inkling of what it was all about. But Goethe knew. She was sending him her ambassador, who was to let him know by his mere presence that death was impatiently waiting behind the door and that Bettina was about to take Goethe's immortality into her own hands. Then death did indeed walk through the door. Goethe struggled for a week. By March 22 lay dying, and a few days later Bettina wrote to Goethe's executor, Chancellor von Müller, "Goethe's death certainly made an indelible impression on me, but not a sorrowful impression. I cannot express the precise truth in words, but it seems to me I come closest to it when I say that it was an impression of glory." Let us note carefully Bettina's emendation, not sorrow, but glory. Shortly thereafter, she asked the same Chancellor von Müller to send her all the letters she had ever written to Goethe. When she read them, she was disappointed. Her whole story with Goethe seemed a mere sketch, perhaps a sketch for a masterpiece, but a sketch all the same, and a very imperfect one at that. It was necessary to set to work. For 3 years she kept correcting, rewriting, adding. Dissatisfied as she was with her own letters, those from Goethe pleased her even less. When now she reread them, she was offended by their brevity, their reserve, and even, at times, their impertinence. At times he wrote to her as if he took her childlike mask literally, as if he were bestowing mildly indulgent lessons on a schoolgirl. That's why now she had to change their tone. Where he called her my dear friend, she put my dear heart. She toned down reprimands with flattering postscripts and added sentences that acknowledged Bettina's power over the fascinated poet as his inspiring muse. Of course, she rewrote her own letters even more radically. No, she didn't alter the tone. The tone was just right, but she altered, for example, their dates to erase the long pauses in their correspondence which might deny the constancy of their passion. She discarded many unsuitable passages, for example, the one in which she begged Goethe not to show her letters to anyone. She added other passages, dramatized various situations, expanded to a greater depth her views on politics, on art, and especially on music and Beethoven. She finished the book in 1835 and published it under the title Goethe's Briefwechsel mit einem Kinder. Goethe's Briefwechsel mit einem Kinder. Goethe's correspondence with a child. Nobody questioned the authenticity of the correspondence until 1920, when the original letters were discovered and published. Alas, why didn't she burn them in time? Imagine yourself in her place. It isn't easy to burn intimate documents that are dear to you. It would be like admitting to yourself that you won't be here much longer, that tomorrow you may die, and so you put off the act of destruction from day to day, and then one day it's too late. Man reckons with immortality and forgets to reckon with death. Now, perhaps when the end of our century provides us with the proper perspective, we can allow ourselves to say Goethe is a figure placed precisely in the center of European history. Goethe, the great center. Not the center in the sense of a timid point that carefully avoids extremes. No, a firm center that holds both extremes in a remarkable balance, which Europe will never know again. As a young man, Goethe studied alchemy and later became one of the first modern scientists. Goethe was the greatest German of all, and at the same time an anti-patriot and a European. Goethe was a cosmopolitan, and yet throughout his life he hardly ever stirred out of his province, his little Weimar. Goethe was a man of nature, yet also a man of history. In love, he was a libertine, as well as a romantic. And something else. Let's recall Agnes in the elevator that shook as if seized by St. Vitus' dance. Even though she was a cybernetics expert, she didn't have any idea what was going on in the head of that machine, which was as strange and impenetrable to her as the mechanism of the various objects with which she daily came into contact, from the small computer next to her phone to the dishwasher. In contrast, Goethe lived during that brief span of history when the level of technology already gave life a certain measure of comfort, but when an educated person could still understand all the devices he used. Goethe knew how and with what materials his house had been constructed. He knew why his oil lamp gave off light. He knew the principle of the telescope with which he and Bettina looked at Jupiter. And while he himself could not perform surgery, he was present at several operations. And when he was sick, he could converse with the doctor in the vocabulary of an expert. The world of technical objects was completely open and intelligible to him. This was Goethe's great moment at the center of European history. A moment that brings on a pang of nostalgic regret in the heart of someone trapped in a jerking, dancing elevator. Beethoven's work begins where Goethe's center ends. It is located in the moment when the world starts gradually losing its transparency, darkens, becomes more and more incomprehensible, rushes into the unknown, while man, betrayed by the world, escapes into his self, into his nostalgia, his dreams, his revolt, and lets himself be deafened by the voices inside him so that he no longer hears the voices outside. That cry from inside sounded to Goethe like an unbearable noise. Goethe hated noise. That's a well-known fact. He couldn't even bear the barking of a dog in a distant garden. It is said that he disliked music. That's an error. What he disliked was the orchestra. He liked Bach because Bach still conceived of music as a transparent combination of independent voices, each of which could be distinguished. But in Beethoven's symphonies, the voices of individual instruments dissolve in an amalgam of clamor and lament. Goethe couldn't bear the roar of an orchestra just as he couldn't bear the loud laments of the soul. Bettina's friends among the younger generation saw the divine Goethe stop up his ears and look at them with distaste. This they couldn't forgive him, and they attacked him as an enemy of the soul, of revolt, and of feeling. Bettina was the sister of the poet Brentano, wife of the poet Arnim, and she venerated Beethoven. She belonged to the Romantic generation, and yet she was a friend of Goethe. Nobody else could claim such a position. She was like a queen ruling over two kingdoms. Her book was a magnificent tribute to Goethe. All her letters were but a single song of love to him. Yes, but because everyone knew about the glasses that Mrs. Goethe had knocked to the ground and about Goethe's infamous betrayal of the loving child in favor of the crazy sausage, that book is at the same time, and to a much greater extent, a lesson in love given to the dead poet, who, on coming face to face with great emotion, behaved like a cowardly Philistine and sacrificed passion to the miserable tranquility of marriage. Bettina's book was at the same time an homage and a thrashing. The year Goethe died, Bettina wrote a letter to her friend Count Hermann von Puckler-Muskau, describing an incident that had occurred one summer 20 years earlier. She said she had had the story straight from Beethoven in 1812, 10 months after the Black Days of the Broken Glasses. Beethoven visited the Teplitz Spa for a few days, and there he met Goethe for the first time. One day he went out for a walk with him. They were walking down an avenue when suddenly they came upon the Empress with her family and entourage. As soon as Goethe saw them, he stopped listening to what Beethoven was saying, stepped to the side of the road, and took off his hat. Beethoven, on the other hand, pulled his hat even farther over his forehead, frowned so that his thick eyebrows shot out another 2 inches, and kept on walking without slowing his pace. And so it was up to the courtiers to stop, stand aside, and make their greeting. It was only after he had passed them that he turned and waited for Goethe. And he told him just what he thought of his servile, lackey-like behavior. He bawled him out as if he were a snot-nosed schoolboy. Did this scene actually take place? Did Beethoven make it up from beginning to end, or did he only add some color, or did Bettina add some color, or did she make it up from beginning to end? Nobody will ever know. But one thing is certain. When she wrote her letter to Puckler-Muskau, she realized that the anecdote was priceless. Only this story was capable of revealing the true significance of her love with Goethe. But how to make it known? "Do you like the story?" she asked Hermann von Puckler-Muskau. "Kannst du sei brauchen?" Can you use it? The Count did not intend to use it, and so Bettina considered the possibility of publishing her correspondence with him. And then something much better occurred to her. In 1839, she published in the journal Athenaeum a letter in which the same story is told by Beethoven himself. The original of this letter, dated 1812, has never been found. All that remains is a copy in Bettina's handwriting. It contains several details, such as the precise date, which show that Beethoven never wrote it, or at least that Beethoven hadn't written it the way Bettina copied it. But whether the letter is a forgery or a semi-forgery, the anecdote enchanted everyone and became famous, and everything suddenly became clear. It was no accident that Goethe gave preference to a sausage over a great love, while Beethoven was a rebel striding forward with his hat pulled down over his forehead and his hands behind his back. Goethe was a servant humbly bowing by the side of the road. Bettina studied music. She even wrote a few compositions and so had some basis for understanding what was new and beautiful about Beethoven's music. Nevertheless, I ask this question. Was it Beethoven's music that captivated her, its notes, or was it rather what the music represented? In other words, its vague affinity to the ideas and attitudes that Bettina shared with her generation. Does love for art really exist, and has it ever existed? Is it not a delusion? When Lenin proclaimed that he loved Beethoven's Appassionata above all else, what was it that he really loved? What did he hear? Music? or a majestic noise that reminded him of the solemn stirrings in his soul, a longing for blood, brotherhood, executions, justice, and the absolute? Did he derive joy from the tones or from the musings stimulated by those tones, which had nothing to do with art or with beauty? Let's return to Bettina. Was she attracted to Beethoven the musician or Beethoven the great anti-Goethe? Did she love his music with the quiet love that draws us to a magical metaphor or to the harmony of two colors on a painting? Or was it rather the kind of aggressive passion that makes us join political parties? Be that as it may, and we will never know the actual truth, Bettina sent into the world the image of Beethoven, striding forward with his hat pulled down over his forehead, and this image has kept on marching down the centuries. In 1927, 100 years after Beethoven's death, the famous German journal Die Literarische Welt asked the most notable contemporary composers what Beethoven meant to them. The editors had no inkling what a posthumous execution this would turn out to be for the man with the hat pulled over his forehead. Auric, a member of the Paris Six, stated in the name of his whole generation, they were so indifferent to Beethoven that he wasn't even worth criticizing. Could he possibly be rediscovered one day and reevaluated, as was the case with Bach 100 years before? Out of the question. Ridiculous. Janacek, too, confirmed that he had never been thrilled by Beethoven's work, and Ravel summed it up. He didn't like Beethoven because his fame was based not on his music, which is obviously imperfect, but on the literary legend built around his life. Literary legend. In our case, it is based on two hats. One is pulled over the forehead with the giant eyebrows. The other is in the hand of a deeply bowing man. Magicians like to work with hats. They let objects disappear in them, or they make flocks of pigeons fly from them to the ceiling. Bettina released from Goethe's hat the ugly birds of his servility, and from Beethoven's hat she caused to disappear, surely unwittingly, his music. She prepared for Goethe what was given to Tycho Brahe and what will be given to Jimmy Carter. Ridiculous immortality. But ridiculous immortality lies in ambush for everyone. To Ravel, a Beethoven with his hat over his eyebrows was more ridiculous than the deeply bowing Goethe. It thus follows that even though it is possible to design, manipulate, and orchestrate one's immortality in advance, it never comes to pass the way it has been intended. Beethoven's hat became immortal. The plan succeeded. But what the significance of the immortal hat would turn out to be, that could not be determined in advance.